Good afternoon. I'm David Johnson, the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, SERL. Thank you for joining us for the first in our virtual briefing series on the legal dimensions of the Israel-Hamas war. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas raises critical questions about the application and interpretation of the law of armed conflict, also known as LOAC. It's also known as international legal principles governing the conduct of war. Searle is pleased to host experts in national security, military strategy, and the law of war to discuss these critical topics. Searle is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, warfare, and democratic governance. Affiliated with Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania, Searle draws from the study of law, philosophy, ethics to answer the most difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflicts. Searle brings together scholars, policymakers, professionals across legal, military, intelligence, and business sectors to research, analyze, and make policy recommendations that address today's challenging issues, such as domestic violent extremism, the use of autonomous weapons, and the protection of civilians in war. Searle carries out its mission through conferences, symposia, research and policy papers, briefings, blog publishing, student projects, and other activities. Each summer, Searle hosts law graduate and undergraduate students interested in national security for a 9-week summer internship program. Searle's interns help further Searle's mission through research, writing, and conference planning, gain valuable insights through the conversations with national security experts on the critical issues facing our nation today. All right, before we get started, I want to do a couple housekeeping things. Questions will be taken from the audience during the last 20 minutes of this presentation, but please feel free to enter your questions anytime in the Q&A box during the conversation and then click send. This event is being recorded and posted on Searle's YouTube channel. Searle was founded in 2012 by the University of Pennsylvania's Law School, Carey Law School's Professor Claire Finkelstein, who's the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at Penn Law School. She has been Searle's faculty director since its inception and is the driving force behind Searle. And I'm going to hand it over to her because we have a lot of material and time is short, and this is very important material. Claire, to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. This is an incredibly important session and series that we are launching today, and I so appreciate the opportunity to speak with our panelists today. Before I introduce them, let me just say that this is the first, as Dave said, in what we intend to be a weekly series. We're going to cover many different aspects of the current conflict between Israel and Hamas from a number of different perspectives. We intend to focus on the law of armed conflict for the most part and on legal aspects of the current conflict. But for some of the sessions, we will cover some of the more general geopolitical issues. Today's session will focus on the legal aspects of the conflict, and here today to discuss those aspects are Geoffrey Korn, who is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and the Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University School of Law. He joined the Texas Tech faculty after a 17-year tenure as a professor of law at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Prior to joining academia in 2005, Professor Korn served in the U.S. Army for 21 years, retiring in the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in 2004, and then serving the Army Senior Law of War as the Army Senior Law of War Advisor. His teaching and scholarship focus is the law of armed conflict, national security law, criminal law, and criminal procedure. As anyone who knows Jeff, as I have for many years, he is absolutely brilliant and encyclopedic, and the author of the casebook that I use for my national security law class. So if any of my students from that class are on, they will know him as the author of that casebook, and a very well recognized expert in the law of armed conflict. Joining us as well is Major Ben Wahlhaus, who served in the IDF International Law Department for 12 years. He has been a part of various IDF military operations, as well as has responsibility for providing legal advice on the IDF's agreements and negotiations with Middle Eastern countries and international partners. Since October 7th, Ben has been in the active reserves. He has, this is not our first chance to talk to Major Wahlhaus. I think in 2015, I had the opportunity to have an extremely interesting conversation with Major Wahlhaus, and I'm really thrilled to have him back again. He's also one of the very bright lights and advising the IDF on many legal matters. And we're very, very glad that he is, and glad to have both of you here today. So thank you so much for joining us for this critical conversation. We're going to jump right into this. And Ben, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, and begin by asking you for a brief update, and then I'm going to ask a few pointed follow-up questions to get us into the discussion before I turn to Jeff.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for having me. Let me just say that I hope this is the first and the last weekly lunch briefing, and that next week the briefing will be about the end of this war with the release of all of our hostages and Hamas's surrender, and no more death and suffering on either side. So as most of your viewers probably know, this war started almost 2 months ago now with Hamas, thousands of Hamas militants invading across the border from Gaza into Israel and raping, torturing, burning alive, murdering over 1,200 people, firing thousands of rockets into Israeli population centers, cities and towns, abducting over 240 people, including infants, children, women, men, entire families, Holocaust survivors, people with disabilities, and so on. These attacks have not stopped. They continue to try to conduct incursions into Israel. We have non-stop rocket fire covering almost all of Israel. We are still identifying our dead from the 7th of October. Some people were burned so entirely that only ashes remain, and it's hard to identify them. Entire families have gone missing, so we have no way of gaining DNA to identify who they are. And there are bodies strewn all throughout Gaza, which our forces are trying to recover. And just today, we recovered one of our missing, who it turned out was killed either on the 7th of October or shortly afterwards. At the same time, we're under attack from the north. We have over 1,000 rockets, drones, anti-tank missiles, shooting attacks from Lebanon and from Syria. Just today, we had a Hamas terrorist cell conduct a shooting attack inside Jerusalem, killed 3 civilians and injured more. We also have ballistic missiles being fired at us from as far away as Yemen. So we're under attack from all directions, from every border. We have over 200,000 people displaced inside Israel from the south and from the north. And as a result of this, we are engaged in intensive hostilities in Gaza. Our aim is to return the hostages, to defeat Hamas militarily, and make sure that they can't attack us again, as they have said they would. Now, obviously, war in its very nature brings suffering, and this war is no different. Hamas does not provide its civilian population with any protection, and it fights from within and amongst their people. And as a result, there is civilian suffering in Gaza, which we're trying to take a lot of steps to alleviate in the same time in tandem with our military operations. It's almost this absurd situation where we are doing more for their civilian population, they're doing themselves. Right at the moment, we're currently at temporary pause. We're allowing Hamas to release hostages every day. Every day that it releases more hostages gains them another day in the pause. But when they stop doing that, we're going to re-engage and keep fighting until our aims are achieved.
Ben, thank you very much for that. Let me ask you then to drill down on Israel's military objective. Can you help us to identify in a very precise way what that objective is in the current conflict?
Sure. So as I said, we have 3 objectives. The first one is to secure the release of our hostages. We still have about 150 people being held hostage, Israelis, foreign citizens, ranging from infants to elderly people. Our second goal is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities inside Gaza, and to make sure that Gaza can't be used as a launching pad for any future attacks. Why are these our aims? The first one is Hamas has said it will attack again. It said very clearly that it will keep attacking, keep doing October 7 style attacks until Israel is completely destroyed. It has a genocidal agenda. You can't negotiate with that. You just have to beat them. This is also not the first time that Hamas has fought with us. We're in an ongoing conflict with them, and this is just the biggest attack they've carried out. It made us realize that there's nothing here to be done other than to completely defeat them. I think what's important to remember in our situation is that we're not fighting across the sea, in a country far away. This is right on our doorstep. This is across our border, and in this case, very much inside our homes. In a matter of hours on October 7, these thousands of militants invaded over 20 communities and towns deep into Israeli territory and killed over 1,200 people. We simply cannot allow that to occur. We have huge amounts of our population which are just refusing at the moment to go back to their homes. You cannot have a situation where entire population numbers will not live in your country. And the whole point of a state is to provide protection for its people. So those are our aims and what we've committed to carrying out.
So one thing that I think is important to clarify here, because Hamas exists in the West Bank, Hamas exists elsewhere in the world, I gather, for example, in South America. But the aim does not include eliminating Hamas wherever it exists, or even killing every member of Hamas in Gaza. It's to eliminate Hamas's military capacity. And can you just clarify what that means?
So yes, that's the mission that the IDF has been given at the moment. The political echelon is the one who decides what our goals of the war are and sets it, and then we translated that into operational plans. And the goal at the moment is to completely go through Gaza and dismantle all of Hamas's military capabilities. That means reaching Hamas wherever it is in Gaza. And it's had 16 years to deeply embed itself throughout Gaza, and it's got its claws into every part of the Gaza urban terrain and the civilian population, and we have to go through and dismantle all of that.
Jeff, if you could just contrast that with what we understand to be Hamas's military objective in the current conflict.
Yeah, first off, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with my friend Ben and with you, Claire, and thank you for the introduction. I think it's really important that people focus in on what Ben just explained. He explained the process by which senior military commanders translate the strategic objective of self-defense into operational objectives in combat. So if we think of the right of the state to act in self-defense, we have to ask, what is the permissible scope of that right? And it's defined by the word necessity. And Ben made the point that people who lived in southern Israel are terrified to go back. So I think if I were the commander of the IDF, my goal, my duty would be to reach a point where I could go back to the prime minister and the war cabinet and say, it's now safe for people to return home. We have restored our security, which is the essence of self-defense. To do that, it has to be translated into traditional military operational objectives. That means you have to identify the key assets of your enemy and destroy those assets. The word destroy is a doctrinal military term. It means to disable your enemy's ability to conduct operations, to render your enemy combat ineffective absent substantial reconstitution. And I think that's what we're seeing the IDF do. So I'm glad Ben made that point. Let's not conflate the hyperbole of eliminate Hamas with the military mission of destroy Hamas's ability to wage military operations against Israel. And as Ben notes, I think Israel in the past has been more restrained because it felt that it was able to manage the threat without fully engaging and destroying this enemy. Hamas threw that in the trash bin on October 7th and basically sent a signal to Israel that unless you completely disable us, we are going to continue to do this.
Yeah, and I would say
that's a traditional military objective. Let's contrast that with Hamas, because I think it's very important. So what are Hamas's strategic objectives? In my view, and having done a number of studies on conflicts in Gaza with high-level American generals, I believe that Hamas's goal is simple to understand, to simply be there when the dust settles, actually and proverbially. So if Hamas is still there, no matter how degraded they've been, to wave their flag and shoot their Kalashnikovs into the air in the streets of Gaza, they've won. they don't view combat the way the IDF or the American military would view it. They don't view combat as an effort to completely defeat your enemy in battle. They know they can't do that against the IDF. They view combat as a supporting effort to their information or misinformation campaign. And what they're trying to do is use combat to create conditions that will put pressure on the Israeli government to not fully achieve its self-defense objectives and stop the operation prematurely. And there are basically two ways they know to do this. And they, as Ben says, they've been preparing for this for 16 years. Number one, create conditions where the IDF has to engage them in areas where the superior combat power of the IDF is degraded. Urban environment. That's what weaker enemies do. They embed themselves in the urban environment. And for Hamas, the subterranean environment is a critical area for their operations. And two, create conditions where the IDF is going to have no choice other than to conduct attacks that result in substantial damage to civilian property and death and injury to civilians, because they know that that's the ammunition that they're going to use in their information Gatling gun at the international level. And we see how effective that is. And why I think it's so important that we understand that, Claire, is because if we fall into the trap of engaging in what I've called effects-based condemnation, that you look at destruction and you say, well, that must be illegal, that must be a war crime, we are playing right into their hands. And we are creating an incentive for them to create more danger for the civilian population, because they know that's their best weapon to achieve their strategic end state of surviving the onslaught.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeff. And this has been badly misreported in the news, and there has been constant talk about the goal being not just to eliminate Hamas, but of course the goal being to destroy all of Gaza, the goal being to destroy the Palestinian people. I think it's very important to identify what the strategic goals of each side in the conflict are. One thing you didn't mention, Jeff, of course, is that Hamas's goal, and Hamas has been very upfront about this, the ultimate goal is to eliminate the state of Israel.
Of course. I mean, I'm talking about what I think is so interesting is how Hamas views its combat effort. Its combat effort is to inflict maximum casualties on the IDF, to create internal pressure within the Israeli society to start asking the question, is this worth it? And create maximum pressure on the IDF externally, or on Israel externally, with this narrative of too many civilian casualties. Now, we can set aside the whole discussion of, are those numbers valid? Where are they coming from? But they have a life of their own, the numbers that are thrown out by Hamas and the Palestinian Health Authority. And we see what's happening. We see it right now. We see high-level U.S. officials saying things like, well, there are too many civilian casualties.
Well,
and I don't want to suggest indifference towards human suffering. I actually think that soldiers who are in the midst of combat understand it better than anybody else and how sad it is. But I do think that when we hear people say, well, there are too many civilian casualties, that's like saying 1 + I don't know = 10. The I don't know is, what was the target? Why was it attacked? What did you do to try and mitigate civilian risk? And what did the other side do to try and increase civilian risk? And unless you know all of that, you are speculating on whether or not that attack produced a result that shouldn't have occurred.
All right, so let's talk about this then, and numbers of civilian casualties. Now, it is extremely difficult to estimate numbers of dead and wounded in war. The numbers that have been used and that are regularly being used in all the major news outlets, at least those published in English that I can read, are those produced by the Palestinian Health Authority, which is run by Hamas. So one side in the conflict is producing the numbers. I have not seen any Israeli estimates of the casualty numbers, civilian casualty numbers in Gaza. Ben, can you speak to that issue and have the Israelis attempted to provide their own estimates of civilian casualty numbers?
Sure. Well, let's just take a second. We're talking here about numbers, but at the end of the day, these are people's lives, and there certainly is a lot of suffering going on, including casualties, but also people in Gaza are displaced. They have limited access to services, and it's not a pleasant situation, to say the least. The first address for complaints for this is Hamas. Hamas has been the de facto governing authority in Gaza for 16 years. For 16 years, it hasn't built any protection for its civilians. It hasn't invested in civilian infrastructure and essential infrastructure for its people. Its leaders have said explicitly that all the tunnels they've built under Gaza are for their own protection, are not for the civilians, and the civilians are someone else's problems, and they explicitly lay it on the UN. They fight from urban areas. They draw the fighting into the urban terrain. They harm their own people. Building tunnels under these structures causes buildings to be unstable and to collapse. Putting booby traps throughout civilian buildings explodes on civilians. Mines under roads detonate on civilians. Their own rockets, over 1,000 of their rockets have failed to leave Gaza and have landed inside Gaza, causing untold amounts of harm. I mean, we all saw that one incident where a rocket landed on the Al-Hali hospital, and Hamas immediately claimed 500 people dead and that it was an IDF strike. And we proved later that they knew themselves that it was an Islamic Jihad rocket. So you can imagine that's times 1,000 how much harm that's causing. And Hamas also prevents their people from reaching safety. One of the biggest efforts that we're trying to do in this operation is to remove people from the zone of the most intensive hostilities, which at the moment is northern Gaza. And we've spent weeks and huge amounts of resources to try and get people to leave northern Gaza with all the suffering and unpleasantry that's involved in that, but to get them out of the line of fire, because how dangerous ground warfare in urban areas can be. And Hamas is trying to prevent that. They're telling their people to ignore our warnings. They're setting up roadblocks to stop people moving south. There are even reports of them shooting civilians in order to deter others. They steal their aid. So all the fundamental reasons for why there's so much civilian suffering in Gaza is on Hamas. Now, that doesn't mean that the results of our operations cause casualties. Of course they do. We are undertaking a huge mission here. We have to rescue over 240 hostages who are hidden all throughout Gaza, including in hospitals. We've seen they've taken them to hospitals, in people's homes, in doctors' clinics, and so on. And we have to dismantle all of their military asset. That requires a huge amount of military firepower and lots of actions. And unfortunately, those actions add up to civilian casualties. Now, if we look in terms of the law, you mentioned this principle of proportionality. Under the laws of armed conflict, the principle of proportionality in attacks requires you to look at two elements that Jeff mentioned. The first is the civilian harm that you expect from an attack, and the second is the military advantage that you anticipate from the attack. And you have to weigh up those two things, and you have to see, is the expected civilian harm excessive in relation to the military advantage that I'm seeking? And if it is going to be excessive, then you cannot carry out the attack. Now, that means you have to look at a few things. Firstly, you do it per attack. You don't look at overall civilian casualty numbers. And from a logical perspective, this makes sense. If there's one attack that causes 500 civilian casualties, you obviously look at that differently, logically and legally, than 500 attacks that causes the same amount of casualties. The second point is that, as Jeff said, we don't look at the effect. We don't look at the outcome. You look at what the commander knew at the time and the decisions that he made. Was it a reasonable decision at the time? Take, for example, if my target is a high-level Hamas commander. That's a big military advantage, and I make this assessment that the expected civilian harm would not be excessive. But it turns out that 20 seconds before the missile hit the building, the commander disappeared into a tunnel under the ground. So technically, I haven't obtained any military advantage, and every civilian harm that I've caused would be excessive. But that doesn't mean you violated the law, because the law is something that looks at your conduct. It doesn't look at the outcome.
Right. So let me, and this is our first session, so I'm going to take the time to put some basic concepts on the table that will be useful for us, not just now, but in future sessions. We want to distinguish here between what we call the jus ad bellum, namely self-defense is Israel's right here and Israel's mission in carrying out these strikes and in these operations. The use in bello refers to the constraints that operate and constraints that must operate on both sides. So the concept of proportionality is a legal constraint that must apply universally, whether you're fighting a war of self-defense or you're fighting for some illegitimate purpose. Both Hamas and Israel are bound by the concept of proportionality. As you say, Ben, proportionality is a matter of weighing the military advantage against anticipated collateral harm. And how do you go about doing that? The argument that many people are making, and there have been a number of reports, and I have to put this on the table, saying that Israel is engaging in war crimes here because the harm is so excessive. And in some cases, some of these reports are arguing that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians. And some of these reports are accusing Israel of genocide. How do you respond to that? And how do you say, Israel is conducting its operations proportionately and observing the principle of distinction, namely, we are not targeting civilians. We do not intend to eliminate or target civilian populations, and we are conducting our operations within the bounds of proportionality.
Jeff, would you like to address the distinction between use ad bello and proportionality and how that has nothing to do with civilian casualty numbers and use in bello, and then I can talk about implementation?
Yeah, sure. So look, you make a really critical point, Claire, and that is in the conduct of military operations, no matter why you're fighting, whether you're fighting for a legitimate, as a legitimate exercise of self-defense, or whether you're fighting for an illegitimate act of aggression, or even people who say, you have a right to fight for self-determination, it is irrelevant on the applicability of the rules that regulate the way you fight. We call this equality of application. All parties to an armed conflict are bound by the same basic principles, and the most fundamental humanitarian principles are the principles that regulate attacks, the conduct of hostilities, and efforts to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. So Hamas is bound just as the IDF is bound by these rules. In terms of the legality of acting in self-defense, yes, there's a proportionality element, but that's derivative to the notion of necessity. You can do all that is reasonably necessary to restore your national security, your safety. That is a proportional act of self-defense. It's no different than if one of your students was walking down the street in Philadelphia and someone swung a punch at her. She's not limited to swinging a punch back and missing. It's not tit for tat. She's allowed to do what is reasonably necessary to restore her security and eliminate the threat. Now, one thing that I have to point out, when we ignore the reality that Ben emphasized, that the rules related to conducting attacks are conduct focused and not result focused, we end up giving a waiver to Hamas because every rocket that Hamas has fired at Israel has been a war crime, not because of a proportionality assessment. You only reach proportionality if you're trying to hit a legitimate military target. If you're trying to hit civilians or terrorize the civilian population, it's a prima facie violation. You don't get past go. So the irony here is, by focusing on outcomes or effects, we look at the destruction in Gaza and we say, oh, that can't be right. That must violate the rules of war. And we ignore the fact that the real violation is the effort by Hamas to kill civilians, not the effort to kill military targets in Israel with an incidental effect on civilians, but actually trying to kill civilians because the Israelis, in large measure, have been effective at neutralizing those attacks through defensive systems. But when I see, for example, people say, oh, I admit that Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th, my reaction is always the same. Not just October 7th. There have been 10 or 12,000 more war crimes committed. Every time they pull the trigger on a rocket without trying to attack a military target, that is a war crime. So we cannot fall into the trap of effects-based critique and effects-based condemnation. The effects of attacks are relevant when assessing compliance with the law, but they are almost never conclusive. We have to know those other factors, and I think Ben can now explain how the IDF targeting process goes through this methodology to make sure that they're acting in compliance with the law.
Right, and Ben, thank you, Jeff. And Ben, when you do that, one of the critiques, if you could address this, is that it's been very hard to be effective against Hamas because they are in those tunnels, because they are sheltering within civilian infrastructure. And so that there's insufficient, ironically, right? So this is sort of ironic that this ends up being an argument against Israel, against the operations here, that it's hard to be effective, and therefore there's insufficient military advantage for the number of civilians that are being killed and wounded.
Okay, so I'll start with that. Yes, it's definitely a hard fight. I don't think, Jeff certainly has more knowledge and experience than me, but I don't know of any conflict where the adversary is so deeply embedded within the civilian environment. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, not even going back to Vietnam. Never has an adversary taken a territory where it's controlled for so long, where it's so well resourced from state backers like Iran, where it's taken everything it has from international aid, the taxes it collects from its own population, and instead of investing in them, invests in its military effort. I mean, just look, for example, at their efforts with hospitals. We've been saying this for years, but now that we're operating in Gaza, we're actually uncovering the evidence that they have systematically turned hospitals into bases for their military operations. They have tunnels inside these hospitals. We've found weaponry, military communication devices, command and control elements. We've shown surveillance footage of Hamas bringing hostages into these hospitals, walking through the front door into the lobby, past all the doctors and the nurses and the ICRC staff, and putting them into there and holding them in these hospitals. We've seen videos of militants walking around hospitals and so on and so forth. And this is not just in one hospital. We've been fired at from a number of hospitals, our ground forces, and so on. And I don't think any conflict, certainly in modern history, has seen this extent of an adversary embedding itself in the civilian environment. So it's definitely challenging. But our operations are certainly not ineffective. We've succeeded in taking out a number of high-ranking Hamas commanders, very serious senior Hamas commanders. We've killed thousands of Hamas militants inside Gaza. We've dismantled much of their military assets in the north. We're curtailing the ability to conduct command and control and to fire rockets. And we've forced them through our military pressure to be in this situation where they're now releasing tens of hostages every day. So our military action certainly has been effective so far.
Let me just pause you there to ask Jeff to comment on the status of hospitals, because I think that needs to be explained to our audiences.
Sure.
What it means for a hospital to have immunity and how you forfeit that immunity.
Well, let's start with a basic premise, okay? This obligation, this equality of obligation, and all the things Ben has talked about, the efforts the IDF makes to select the right target, to attack it with precision, to evacuate civilians, that obligation, that civilian risk obligation, do everything feasible to mitigate the risk to the civilian population, applies to both sides, both the attacker and the defender. And for the defender, the application of that rule means that you are not allowed to deliberately exacerbate the risk to civilian populations in order to gain some military advantage, i.e. place a command post under a hospital. A hospital is a civilian object. And in the First Geneva Convention, when we're dealing with military medical facilities, it's treated as the most protected object on the battlefield, because if you believe the enemy military is misusing its military hospitals for acts that are harmful to you, you have to issue a warning and give them a reasonable time to comply. There's a lot of confusion on the applicability of that warning rule. If an enemy like Hamas is embedding assets under a civilian military hospital, you don't issue the warning to the hospital, because the hospital is not responsible for the misuse. You issue the warning to the enemy. and you tell the enemy, you need to get out of there and stop using that, or else we're going to attack your target. And that, by the way, is an extension of the rule related to military medical facilities, which the IDF has done. But ultimately, any civilian object can be transformed into a military objective, and any military objective, once it's subject to attack, can create risk to proximate civilian objects. So if I were an advisor to American commander and we found an enemy command post embedded under a civilian hospital, we would not attack the hospital. We would attack the command post. We would warn the enemy to stop doing it because we're trying to protect the hospital. If we felt we had to do it, we would probably warn the hospital so they could evacuate. But ultimately, we'd have to make a proportionality judgment. Are we going to allow the enemy to get the benefit of that facility with immunity because of its own violation of embedding that military asset in a way that's designed to shield it from attack?
So this is extremely important when we talk about the numbers, because when we see the numbers of dead reported, again, taking Hamas's own numbers as the constant touchstone that we see in news reports, there is no distinction made as to whether or not civilians are being killed because they are being used as human shields. There's also no distinction being made as to whether or not Hamas fighters are themselves in those numbers. So
well, apparently the IDF is not effective because based on the numbers I've seen, they haven't killed one Hamas belligerent operative. Every death is attributed as a civilian, which is, we know, right, is absurd. But I think I want to make one other point here. You talk about human shielding. You may know that I did an article a few years ago I titled it Indirect Civilian Targeting. The notion of human shielding is a categorical war crime, and it's a terrible thing. It's when you use a civilian to try and prevent the enemy from attacking. That's what the word shield means. I'm going to stop you from attacking. I believe Hamas does something even worse. They want the Israelis to attack. They know the Israelis have to attack, and they want to use civilians as fodder for their information campaign. So in a sense, what are they doing? They are murdering their own civilians. They're just using Israeli military attacks as the instrument of that murder. They don't want to shield their targets. They want them to, the Israelis to conduct or they know the Israelis will conduct the attack. They need those civilian casualties to advance this information narrative.
Yeah, and in a particularly strange twist of using human shields, apparently there are news reports, Jeff, you and I just talked about this, in which Hamas may have placed hostages in the homes of UN NGO workers. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, listen, Ben is probably in a better position to talk about the legal ramifications. I would say, I think when we know that there's such a tyrannical autocratic regime like Hamas running the place, we have to be a little bit cautious of assuming that those individuals who owned those homes were complicit in the hostage taking. I could imagine Hamas shows up, and why would they want to put a hostage in the home of a UNRWA teacher? Because they know that place is probably on a no-strike list by the Israeli Defense Forces. And so they show up and they say, you're going to put him in here. And if you tell anybody that he's in here, if you do anything to help him, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill your family. I don't know if these are actions of complicity on the part of these civilians or they're actions of under duress. And I think that I would just say, I think we have to be a little bit cautious before we categorically condemn. For example, I saw the videos of hostages being brought into the hospital. I think if I were a doctor or a nurse in that hospital, I'd be pretty hesitant to challenge a Hamas fighter saying you're not allowed to bring them in here, because I'd be worried I'd get killed myself. But maybe Ben can comment on this better than I can.
Yeah, look, these are all important issues, but I think in terms of the IDF, I should speak to what we're doing to try and mitigate these civilian casualties, because it's true that sometimes there are human shields, and Hamas is really perfected that practice to an art. They know how to They know how to keep their people in their area of hostilities. They know how to tell them to go up to the roof when we provide warnings of individual strikes. They know how to intimidate them into staying where they are, and they know how to hide under them. But that doesn't mean that, we don't take steps, or we're released from taking steps from trying to mitigate the civilian casualties. Firstly, whatever the other side does, we're still beholden to international law. We're a military of a democratic state that's committed to the rule of law. And above our legal obligations, we also have ethics. Sometimes the legal obligation is the bottom. It's the starting point. This is what you have to do for the law, but our ethics, our values, sometimes requires us to do more. So in the face of these very challenging circumstances, we have this asymmetry of a state that's trying to commit to international law against an adversary that does everything it can to exploit that. We utilize a lot of measures to try to mitigate civilian harm. And that ranges from the choice in weaponry that you're using for each and every attack. It relates to the timing of the attack to try and do it at a time that would minimize civilian casualties. It applies to aborting attacks when we understand that the civilian presence is greater than we initially expected. And obviously you don't see when we abort attacks because they don't happen. So for every attack that does happen, there are a number of attacks that haven't. The biggest effort, as I said, has been to try and get people out of the zone of the most intensive hostilities. And this has been a huge effort. To date, we've sent over 14 million text messages to Gazan telephones, made 11 million pre-recorded phone calls, made over 40,000 individual personalized calls warning people to get out of these areas, or even individual targets. And that's in addition to social media messaging, to radio messaging, to TV broadcasts, and so on. And all these messages contain detailed information: where to go, when to go, what's waiting for you in the areas that are a bit safer. And as I said, Hamas is trying to prevent that. They're setting up roadblocks and they're trying to keep people in harm's way. So in addition to those efforts, we're trying to alleviate the suffering that we cannot avoid. So as I said, we've been facilitating aid through the crossing with Egypt and Gaza. Every day, thousands of tonnage of medical supplies, food and water, and a bit more fuel and cooking gas has been going through. We're working with third parties, with countries, to set up field hospitals, both inside and outside of Gaza. We're facilitating the exit of people for medical treatment outside of Gaza. We provide from our own water. Israel provides its own water supplies to Gaza. And we've been implementing these humanitarian corridors and pauses in order to allow people to continue leaving the areas of hostilities. Unfortunately, this too, Hamas is trying to scuttle. They steal aid. The UN has come out publicly and said that Hamas has broken into its premises, which is a violation of their inviolability, to steal their aid. They've damaged their own infrastructure. On October 7, 9 out of the 10 electricity lines that ran from Israel into Gaza were destroyed by Hamas fire. 1 out of the 3 water pipes that delivered water from Israel to Gaza were hit by Hamas fire. Hamas invaded the main crossing in the north of Gaza, the Erez crossing, completely destroyed it and killed personnel there and abducted others. And before that, almost 20,000 Gazans were crossing through that crossing into Israel every day to provide work. So we can't alleviate all of the suffering. There's certainly tragic consequences as a result of war, and Hamas just needs to stop. It needs to return the hostages and put down its arms.
Look, Claire, this is a classic illustration of the bigotry of disparate expectations, right? So all the expectations are that Israel needs to do more to mitigate civilian risk. As a former Army intelligence officer, I will tell you that when Ben talks about these warnings, these measures, these supporting access to supplies, I'm always thinking that always has some detrimental effect on our combat operations. It always gives a little advantage to the enemy. That's the burden of responsible command. You have to make a judgment. Am I willing to let the enemy know I'm going to attack to save civilians? Am I willing to allow civilians to get access to humanitarian aid, knowing some of it will be siphoned off to the enemy? And clearly the Israeli commanders are acting out of their sense of respect for that constant care obligation. And yet the side of the fight that's consistently condemned is not the side that's exacerbating civilian risk, while at the same time trying to attack civilians. It's the side that's taking all these measures in its best effort to mitigate the risk that the enemy has exacerbated. It's just unfair.
Jeff, doing more and more, you might be interested to note that someone who is known to many of us who writes on the law of war, Michael Gross, has an interesting op-ed in the New York Times today in which he argues that Israel should pay compensation to wounded civilians in Gaza. And
Well, there's no LOAC obligation to do
there's
that.
no LOAC obligation. He acknowledges
It's a policy judgment, and Ben made that point, right? Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's always right. And sometimes you do more than you're legally obligated to do. And I'm sure those are issues that the political domain will be struggling with in Israel. But in terms of the conduct of hostilities, I think the ledger is clear. One side is trying to mitigate risk, and the other side is trying to exacerbate it. And that should be the consistent focus of condemnation.
Let me turn to some of the questions now that are in the chat. And I'm going to ask them fairly rapid fire. We'll get through as many of them as we can. First question, do you feel there is coordination between Hamas and Hezbollah, Iran, and other groups? How does that complicate the legal picture and the potential for negotiations? Ben, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, there definitely is coordination. I mean, they're all coordinated by Iran. Hamas openly is, funded by Iran, trained by Iran, resourced by Iran, and Iran openly says this, that they're funding Hamas and that Hamas works in coordination with them. Same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria is, best buddies with Iran, and they work closely with Iran. But we're focusing on the conflict now in Gaza. As I said, we're coming under serious attack from the north, over 1,000 attacks over the last couple of months that have killed civilians and have injured civilians and have caused serious amounts of civilian harm in the north of Israel, so much so that we've had to evacuate over 100,000 people from the north of Israel. So certainly, this is all connected. This is all Iran's part of how to attack Israel. Same with the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen are also in coordination with Iran, and they're firing ballistic missiles and armed drones towards Israel. We have our friends, Jeff's old colleagues in the US armed forces who are stationed all around the Middle East and who are helping us defend against those threats.
But I would also add, Claire, in response to that question, I think it relates to the scope of self-defense in Gaza, because it's this coordination that influences the perception of what is necessary to ensure our security. If we know that this coordination exists, you cannot afford to allow a combat-capable entity to remain on your southern border when you know what you're already facing on your northern and western borders. It's all connected. You can't analyze this by looking through a straw. You have to understand the interrelationship of all of these threats when you assess the legitimate scope of self-defense.
Very good. All right, next question. Could you speak about the potential lawful use of belligerent reprisals by Israel as a means to enforce compliance with the law of war by Hamas?
I mean, I'll respond to that. I think if we thought for a second that Hamas cared about its own people, then you could theoretically be thinking about reprisal. They don't care about their own people. Who are you going to commit reprisal against? You're going to take an action. You're going to target civilians or civilian property to send a message to Hamas that you better start following the rules. It's futile. And I think unless a nation believed absolutely that the threat of reprisal would have a significant influence on their opponent, even threatening it would be completely off the table.
Well, and I think moreover, the framework here is the framework of self-defense. That's the framework that Israel is operating under. And as you point out, the potential for coordination with Hezbollah and other threats that Israel is facing make the threat of an existential nature. So the self-defense framework is certainly sufficiently capacious. One doesn't need to be talking about reprisals.
Well, and let's also keep in mind, as we've said a couple of times, this is a battle on two planes. there's the operational battle, and there's the strategic information battle. Too many people in the world are already accusing Israel of engaging in reprisal. The last thing they need to do is to say we're going to conduct an operation to exercise the right of belligerent reprisal, which I think is a relatively antiquated rule of the LOAC.
Right.
If I may be so rude, I'll choose a
Please.
question because
Go
it's a
ahead,
topic we haven't discussed it. Someone's asked here about humanitarian aid that's been hoarded by Hamas in Gaza. So I'll
I
just
was
take
about
this
to ask that.
talk
Go
about
ahead.
the legal aspects. So under international law, the law of armed conflict, there's no requirement that one side of the party provides supplies to the other party, right? I don't have to give the other party the very things he needs to keep attacking me. You know, Hamas has plenty of fuel. It could release that fuel and not use it for its tunnels, and it could give that to its own population and help support them. I don't have to give from my fuel to the other side. The requirement under international law, under LOAC, is that you allow and facilitate access to essential supplies that are needed for the population's survival. And here too, firstly, we need to look at Hamas. Hamas is not providing for its own civilian population. It's stealing supplies for its own military purposes. It's hoarding them, and so on and so forth. But Israel is fulfilling that provision of international law. We are facilitating our humanitarian aid coming through Egypt and in many other ways. In fact, I think we're going beyond that. You know, some of the supplies that are coming into Gaza now are supplies that exist in Gaza. They have them. Hamas has them as the de facto governing authority. Its responsibility is to release them to their population. But we're still letting that through. An important thing to realize that under the law of conflict, there are conditions to allowing and facilitating that aid. And one of the conditions is that you have no serious reasons of concern to fear that aid will be diverted from the civilian population, from its intended target, or will otherwise accrue to the enemy's military advantage. And in this case, we know that that's what's happening. We know that Hamas is stealing humanitarian aid. It's been happening for years. That's how they built their military arsenal up to be what it is. The UN has said explicitly that it's coming into their premises and stealing their fuel. We're hearing it from private business owners in Gaza anyway. And that's why it's so important that we have these technical arrangements with the US, with Egypt, with other partners, that we're able to check what's going into Gaza, that we have these security arrangements to make sure that what's coming in now, it actually gets to the civilian population and to where it's actually needed, and not gets into the hands of Hamas.
Yeah. Let me turn
Claire,
to another.
could I take a little
ahead.
initiative and answer Jules' question? What happens when the other side does not play by the same
Sure.
rules, i.e. the LOAC?
Sure.
Jules, I would tell you that's the point where our own compliance becomes that much more important.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the function of this law is to mitigate the suffering of war, the suffering of captives, the suffering of civilians, even the suffering of combatants to a certain degree, certainly the wounded and sick. If one side doesn't follow the rules and the other side views that as a waiver or a justification for not following them, we exacerbate the human suffering doubly. That's one reason why it's a unilateral commitment. Even if you know your enemy's not going to follow the rules, you have to try that much harder to do so. And I think the other reason is we have to remember that the people fighting this war are young men and women like our friend Ben, my friend Ben. They have to live with the consequence of being engaged in mortal combat for a long time. And anybody who's never contemplated what that means, to have a commander look at another human being and point and say, attack, it's hard to appreciate what that moral challenge. Those rules help commanders help their subordinates navigate the moral abyss of mortal combat. Good commanders, responsible commanders know that their job to protect their subordinates is not just to protect them from the physical consequences of war, but also from the moral consequences of war. And operating within a rule set, being able to look back and say, I wish I hadn't had to fight that war, but I'm proud that I did it in accordance with the rules I was taught, plays an important role in preserving that moral integrity.
That's great. Let me pivot to another thing that's in the questions asked by two different people. The IDF instructed, implored, warned, and in every possible way tried to cajole people in Gaza to evacuate to the south. Now it appears that when the temporary truce is over and operations resume, that they will resume most likely in the south. How should we think about efforts to minimize civilian casualties when a large portion of the population has moved from the north to the south based on IDF's own request, and now the bulk of the fighting will be in the south?
Okay, so let's talk operationally and legally. Operationally, we never said go to the south, you'll be safe there. We've said go to the south because it'll be safer. We know that the most intensive hostilities in the first few weeks were in the north. We knew that that's where our ground forces were going, and you know that you don't want civilians caught up in those ground forces, in that ground combat. I mean, think of it, Hamas is firing on our troops inside northern Gaza. It's detonating civilian buildings that are booby-trapped. It's detonating mines that are under the roads. It's detonating weapons placed in tunnels inside building. There's massive amounts of destruction caused as a result of ground combat. And we have to protect our forces in order that they can fulfill their mission. And that also causes a lot of kinetic activity. So the best thing for those civilians to do is to get out of that ground combat. Now, that doesn't mean that the south is completely immune from operations. If we had done that, the only thing it would do is incentivize Hamas to go down to the south and start operating from there. And in fact, that's what it's done in many cases. Over the past few weeks, I think over 90% of the rocket firing into Israel has emanated from South Gaza. And we know that Hamas is operating in southern Gaza. But all we wanted to do is try and make things as much safer as we could than being caught up in the ground combat. Now, when hostilities will renew, and they will renew because we haven't achieved our overall aims yet, it will renew wherever it needs to happen. Wherever we need to attack Hamas, who's continuing to carry out attacks against Israel, who's sworn to recommit October 7 style massacres, and who's still holding our hostages, that's where we'll operate. Now, in terms of the law, it doesn't mean anything in terms of a change in the rules. The same rules still apply. You still have to abide by the principle of distinction and attack military objectives. You still have to take feasible precautions in order to mitigate civilian harm. You still have to abide by the principle of proportionality in tax and weigh up that estimated civilian harm and see if it's excessive in relation to the military advantage. So all those things are still required, and all those things we still have to abide by. The question is just in terms of implementation and what the circumstances require. So say, for example, if we look at this concept of military advantage, in the first few weeks when I just had aerial operations, so taking out a Hamas sniper post or a Hamas mortar squad or a Hamas anti-tank squad doesn't have a massive military advantage. But now that I have ground forces inside Gaza, taking out all those things provides a much greater military advantage because I have ground forces there and the huge threat that snipers and mortars and anti-tank fire poses to my forces. So all the rules still apply. You just have to look at the context in which you're applying them to.
Hang on, Ben, but is it not slightly different from the original calculations that one makes? Because having encouraged in whatever form the population to evacuate to the south, even if it was never you'll be fully safe in the south, but you'll be safer, is there not some additional burden on Israel to try to heighten its efforts?
The first thing is this might tie into a legal aspect. There's nothing in the law which says, okay, because civilian populations have evacuated to somewhere, now they count for more in the proportionality analysis. It doesn't work like that. So here there might be policy requirements which say because of our ethics or because of our strategic interests or because of the requests of our strategic partners, we might change things or do things differently. But in terms of the law, there's no difference because of what you've done beforehand. And, this goes back to what Jeff was saying, that this would be, a strange outcome of our efforts to try and help people, to try and save people at the beginning in the face of their own government, which is trying to endanger them as much as possible, to then say, oh, because you are now helping them, now your hands are more tied. And this is something we have to be careful that we don't do, that we take the steps that the IDF is trying to do in order to help civilians, in order to mitigate the huge amounts of suffering that there are and the tragic consequences of this war, and try not to use that against future efforts of the IDF to achieve its military goals.
And I also think, Claire, that in that situation, we should be asking a more fundamental question. If the Israelis are compelled to conduct attacks in the south, why is Hamas there? I mean, that, every time there's
correct, because they use civilian populations to shield their operations, so they follow the civilian populations.
Exactly.
Precisely, but it wouldn't be strange if, in fact, efforts to help civilians carried with them some additional duties of continued help, because there are many situations in life in which that's the case. You do.
No, I think this touches on something that's maybe a bigger picture issue, and Jeff was talking about this a little bit. When I look at the Red Cross's Twitter feed, and the Red Cross, his Twitter over the past few weeks has been about the protection of hospitals. And when does a hospital lose its protection, and what steps must a person or an attacking party take when a hospital's lost its protection? But you don't see one tweet, not one statement deploring Hamas's exploitation of these hospitals in the first place. Right. You have a non-state actor, a terrorist organization that is systematically and purposely and in a huge manner exploited this entire network of hospitals throughout Gaza for its military operations. That's where our efforts should be at, because if the ICRC and other international organizations do not consistently deplore this practice and do not take steps in order to stop it, and instead put all their focus on the party that is committed to international law and that is trying to do its best to alleviate civilian suffering, then all you're doing is incentivizing these organizations, not just in Gaza, but around the world as well. I can promise you Hezbollah is watching, the remnants of ISIS are watching, and they can see that if they can get away with this large-scale exploitation of international law against states that are committed to international law, then this will just become more and more popular and widespread around the world. So we always have to remember what is the root cause of what's happening here, and where do we need to put our efforts in order to stop it as much as possible.
And unfortunately, Ben, it's not just the ICRC that's taking that approach, but many organizations seem to be ignoring this same factor. Well, we are out of time. I thank you both so much. I hope you'll both come back. This has been a wonderful discussion, extremely clarifying, and there's so many more things for us to talk about. We just scratched the surface here, but I very much hope that you will both come back on a future week. We need you and your clarification. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Ben.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This event has been recorded, and in a few days will be posted on Searle's YouTube channel. And we ask that you please join us for our next installment, which will be on Wednesday, December 6th, 2023 at 12 noon Eastern Time, where Professor Finkelstein will moderate a conversation with retired General Joseph Votel, the former commander of U.S. Central Command and a distinguished senior fellow on national security at the Middle East Center, and more importantly, a member of Searle's executive board, on the complexities of using civilians as human shields. This event will be pushed out by our team, and there will be a link in there. And I thank everybody for which inarguably was a fascinating discussion on this topic, and we look forward to continuing it on December 6th. Thank you.